Hello, my name is David Thorpe, and I'm the Community Manager of Sustainable Cities Collective, the foremost website for leading urban thinkers everywhere. I'm delighted to welcome today Chuck Wolfe, who's going to talk about his book, Urbanism Without Effort. Now, besides being on the advisory board of Sustainable Cities Collective, Chuck is an attorney in Seattle, where he focuses on land use and environmental law and permitting. He writes about urban growth management and innovative zoning, transit-oriented development, and brownfield sustainable development topics. His book, Urbanism Without Effort, published by Island Press, came out earlier this year and received excellent reviews. No less than the mayor of Seattle said it was a must-read, and Alex Stephen, the author of Carbon Zero, Imagining Cities That Can Save the Planet, called it a plea for a renewed commitment to authentic urbanism and an invitation to learn from history. Because Chuck is a photographer, it's no surprise that Cade Benfield, the Director of Sustainable Communities for the Natural Resources Defense Council, said it was brilliant at capturing visual images of everyday but evocative city life. The book is in fact peppered with fantastic photographs that Chuck has taken from his travels all over the world in the last 30 years. Chuck's book is about what happens when art meets science in placemaking. Now, given all this praise, the first question I want to ask you, Chuck, is about the passion that comes over in this book. It feels like you've been wanting to write it for a very long time.
Well, thanks, David, and good morning from here, and good afternoon to you in South Wales. Yeah, that's very true. My dad was a planning professor, and that's something that I talk about, I believe, in the first chapter. And so I come by this by osmosis, and as you kindly indicated, I've been at law practice for close to 30 years now, and I realized during that period and during my professional experiences of advocacy, whether for or against a project, whether working for or against a municipality, that there was something else that often isn't stated in a more professional regulatory context. And that is that there's this latent need that we all have as humans to interact with our cities in certain ways, that cities of all sizes. And what I wanted to do, and I think the passion you feel, is go back to those basics and figure out what was motivating the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard types, what is motivating the regulators, and do my best to emulate some of the great writers from the past and demonstrate what it is as human beings we all really care about.
That's fantastic. And in that regard, what is your favourite city? What city do you think does this best? Or perhaps what part of what city is a more precise question?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question, and you caught me off guard. Although it's something I've been asked before. I'm going to answer it a little bit indirectly, I think, because what I've found I love to do is find places that aren't being written about right now on a major league level. Although I certainly love Barcelona, and I love Rome, and I love Melbourne's Docklands and London's efforts at redoing industrial areas. I mean, I love all the places that people are writing about today. But what I also love to do is go to places, as I think I say in the book, less well known, less described. Often they're island countries or island possessions of the former major world powers. Just spent time on Corsica. Been to Malta in the past, spent time in Iceland earlier in the year. Why? I think it's because I'm trying to look at the role of indigenous culture as it evolves in a somewhat isolated framework. And so what that has told me in these informal investigations is that a lot of common human-city relationships are manifested in Valletta, Malta, in Reykjavik, in places that have evolved from a common cultural founding, perhaps, and then evolved on their own. So that's the indirect answer. You know, what's that? You know, I love Melbourne, Australia. How's that? and
Okay,
it's
that's a good
part of
answer.
it is part of it is how they've taken a very healthy um, tram system over time and continue to work with it. And even today, you hear about wonderful apps applied to the age-old Melbourne tram system that is still evolving a central city orientation that we're all looking for. How's
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
But I mean, you say that in the book that traditional and active close-knit spaces and spontaneous human interactions of the historic city are re-emerging as key components of a more lively urban future. Now, this seems in a way an obvious thing to say. When we go to the places that you've mentioned, we can tell how vibrant and how human scale they are, and how lively and how they're created, and they're an ideal space for creative human interactions. It seems obvious, so why do you think it's been submerged in recent years?
Well, you know, that's a very good question as well. I think it's been submerged in popular culture. I know that growing up and having a father who cared about this stuff deeply, um, he was much more isolated in his thinking in those days. I'd say climate change, other economic pressures, the cost of transport, the cost of housing, um, the shareables movement, the realization that there's simpler ways to live have brought these notions back to the forefront. And I mean, we can be trite about Back to the Future and all that, but what I have noticed is that the things that not only I used to hear from my dad, but I learned in planning school before I went to law school, are now much more in the common domain, and I think that it's for the reasons I've just stated. However, it's very interesting because I just was honored to go back and keynote a housing conference in New Hampshire across the United States and speak to representatives from the multiple towns of New Hampshire. And they too, at their scales, are hankering for some of the things we're talking about. And I was able to ironically tell them in some ways, and it was nothing new for them, but they needed a reminder to go look around. They, if anyone, had the roots of it all, you know, the common ideas attributable to the New England town in our country, which is to some degree what you've just described. We're trying to emulate that closeness of live and work, the idea that even to be a member of a community, as was sometimes in the bylaws of these towns, you couldn't live more than a certain distance from the town green. And the reason that it was especially delightful to remind people in New Hampshire of that was not only that my dad had been raised 30 miles to the south, and I think always carried the New England town ideal with him, hence, you know, evolution down to me, but they often have the capacity with the history that's still, just as for you, the history that can be seen all around them, they can go recreate through simple walks, photography, journals, which is something I talk about in the book, these roots and these concepts that you've mentioned. So,
You think that even if a place has no history, like it's a new or expanded
right.
settlement, it can still successfully borrow or invent ideas from the past. So would you say that village greens and garden cities are good examples of this? Or do you think planners should just get out of the way? Because, I mean, there were no planners at one point.
And you know, this is at the heart of the discussion in the last 6 months about the book, that question. In Seattle, when it was first written up in our Daily Journal of Commerce, the real estate reporter loved the concept that perhaps I was advocating less regulation, you know, and other organizations have taken that message. No, I'm not saying planners should get out of the way. I'm saying that planners should be more contextual. And before they pull off a populist or popular solution, they should think about the context of where they are and whether an idea from an Italian square is really going to work when introduced in a parking space. I love parking day. I love pop-up urbanism. I love tactical urbanism. Um, some reviewers have thought that I've been too critical of these popular notions today, only to the degree that I would hope that people, when they come and recommend these solutions, are thinking about them contextually. And so your example of a place with no history, the place may have no history, but it has probably a culture and a topography and a socio-economic reality, climate reality. And I think I say in the book what works in southern Italy may not work in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So to your question, I would say, no, planners, don't get out of the way. Just be contextual. And when you bring an idea to a place, think about the fit.
There are plenty of pressures that are piling against this kind of approach. There's planning policy, there's budget constraints, and there's corporate pressures, in particular, that have been well documented by writers like Ian Sinclair in London. Do you think that these are destructive tensions or creative tensions?
With challenge, there's always opportunity. And I think we saw in the American recession, which we're really not quite out of in some respects, but we saw some tremendous innovation fostered by relative economic challenge. We're seeing here in my hometown, here in Seattle, a very successful resurgence based on the fact that Amazon is essentially redeveloping some major sections of downtown Seattle and north of downtown Seattle for their headquarters, which will and are leading to implementation of some of the concepts we've discussed. How contextual remains to be seen. But I think through the economic forces, at least sometimes, you're going to get some great results. I mean, the poster child is, of course, downtown Detroit and how it has, with corporate cash infusion and some major interest by native son million and billionaires, fostered a laboratory for urban reinvention. So I think there's the creative side. Obviously, the other side that we're seeing, and this is not really in the book, but we're both being philosophical here, is there's tremendous challenges to remain economically inclusive. And so perhaps the solutions that I've just described are creative class solutions that are not going to trickle down. And perhaps what I'm saying in the book is some of the purest forms of urbanism as we know it need to trickle up from the vernacular. Yes. Not exclusively, by any means. I do in the book talk about the difference between everyday urbanism and other approaches. But in the end, I would answer your question, challenge and opportunity, and in some places it's going to be tremendous success. The question is whether it can be inclusive success.
And that sounds like a good way to wind up the interview, Chuck. Urbanism Without Effort is available from Island Books, and there'll be a link at the end of this interview on the accompanying webpage for you to click through and buy a copy. So thank you very much, Chuck, for joining us today on Sustainable Cities Collective. Bye for now.
My pleasure.